Welcome to She Said Homestead, the podcast that explores homesteading from a range of perspectives. We're Sage and Mickayla, two homesteaders, each with unique experiences, properties, and future goals for our homesteads. We're discussing various homesteading topics, sharing our personal experiences as women working full-time who are managing homesteads as well, and shining a light on the stories of other inspiring homesteaders.
Before we dive in, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoy our podcast, please consider leaving a review. It really helps us grow and share these homesteading stories with even more people.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Sage from Terra Nova Acres.
And I'm Mickayla from Calico Cow Acres, and we both have homesteads in Western North Carolina.
Today, we're going to be talking about some of the best advice for beginner gardeners. But before we get into that, tell me a little bit about your week, Mickayla.
I've kind of just been getting used to having a set schedule with work things again, getting little bits of garden things done when I can, and we did a lot of mulching this weekend. I did a lot of weeding. I've pretty much just been weeding. That's the majority of my life at this point, is pulling weeds out of the garden and trying to get all the beds ready for planting, because that's coming up very, very quickly. And for some things, I'm like already late.
Yeah, I feel like this time of year is tricky. One, because us gardeners are getting the itch to just get our plants out. But then we also have probably, if you're like us, decided to plant so many things that you feel behind, and it feels like you're never going to get back on schedule, even though it's really not that big of a deal for a couple things to be planted out, 2 weeks, even a month out. They'll still grow. They'll still do their thing.
Honestly, the early last frost, what I'm assuming is the early last frost, is really throwing me off. Like, I had my plan, and I'm like, well, I could plant all of the things now. And that's not helping my urge to be out there whatsoever. It's tough.
Yeah, that's fair. What's interesting is I thought that the early last frost, the date, the planting date being way earlier than I thought it would be, I thought that would stress me out so much. But then I, panic started all my seeds in this last week, and it was kind of nice to just do it all at once, because that's the kind of person I am, right? Like, I'd rather just do everything all at once instead of do it a little bit at 6 weeks, do it a little bit at 4 weeks, do it a little bit at 2 weeks. It was kind of nice to just do it.
Yeah, I'm to the point where I kind of need to do that. And it's like 2.5 weeks until my observed last frost. I'm like, I need to start the rest of the stuff. I've decided this weekend I'm just gonna direct sow a bunch of things and get them in the ground because they need to be out, and then I don't have to worry about transplanting them or potting anything up at this point. But I did just start a couple trays of flowers. Oh, mostly flowers. I had to redo one type of tomato that for some reason didn't come up, and it probably was me. I probably forgot to put seeds in that cup, if I had to guess, because none of them came up. And then I did like a lot of nasturtiums and sunflowers and Mexican sunflowers, which I think that's Tithonia is what that's called, Mexican sunflowers. I did a bunch of those, a bunch of basil. Yeah, I'm like ready for the warm weather things. We also, I feel like I mentioned it recently. I'm not sure if I mentioned it on the podcast or in a video or something, but we had one of our chickens just randomly pass away for no reason. She was acting a little bit weird the night before, and then in the morning she was just not alive anymore. I don't know what happened with her. And then we had one this weekend acting kind of odd, and so we brought her in and kind of kept an eye on her for a couple days. We think she's okay. She seems fine. But when we were bringing her back out to the coop, after she'd been in for a few days, one of the ducks was limping. And there's just like never a point like during the year that we don't have a bird hospital going on in the basement. Like, there's just always a bird issue around here, and I don't know why. Like, I take care of them. I promise. They're always just like hurting themselves. So I think what happened with the duck, Stella, I think she got her toenail, like her dew claw, which is like the thumb claw, basically. stuck in like the salad bar hardware cloth, or some sort of thing happened, and it basically just like it's twisted and mangled, and just that toe is like backwards. Sorry to gross everybody out. I feel like I gross everybody out in every episode. Yeah, so her whole foot was really swollen. I know it's not Bumblefoot because she was perfectly fine the entire day, and then we put them in the run before we went in for dinner, and a few hours later she was all messed up. And her foot was like a golf ball. And that's big for those ducks. Like, they are not big animals. So we've been soaking her, she's been inside. Yeah. I think she's gonna be okay. But just all the bird drama as usual around here.
Yeah, the animal and especially bird injuries always seem to happen back to back to back. It's like when it rains, it pours with those sorts of things. And then, at least for me, there will be a stint where everything's fine and you forget. And the next busy season hits and you're like, oh, right, this is homesteading. Okay, yeah, I remember now.
I feel like there's not ever a break for us at this point. Like, it's been almost a year. We got them in mid-June, so we haven't even had them for a full year yet, and it's been back to back to back to back. So it has been like when it rains, it pours hardcore. When the last one passed away, like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, the same week, like within the same couple of days, Taylor was on his way to work and his truck, like all the truck issues happened. He had to get the truck towed home, and like now we have to redo the entire transmission in there. His car issue, like his car tires are all messed up in the suspension, so like he didn't have a car for a couple days. We had to get that figured out. I feel like there were a couple other things that happened all at once, and it was just a lot to deal with. It's not even just the bird things that when it rains, it pours. It's all of the things. The bird stuff just stresses
Yeah,
me
just
out
life.
most. Yeah, but like the birds, I feel so bad because I'm like, you are in my care and I want to take care of you, but please stop hurting yourself. Please. Not good for my stress level, and it's not good for you. What were you up to this week?
You know, I'm having a harder time remembering that for this last week than most weeks, which probably means that I've been busier. So, yeah, last week was the realization that we're probably past our last frost because I'm a little bit colder than you. And then actually ended up having 2 nights of frost. So now I think I'm past my last frost. I didn't lose anything in those frosts. Everything is hardy except for my artichokes, and I covered them with Agrabah. They're totally fine. So those frosts didn't do any damage, but I did start, yeah, basically everything that I need for my garden. My beans, my squash, my cucumbers, my okra, all of my herbs and things. Like, I just started everything. And there are a few things that didn't make the list, some flowers that I need to start, but I also need to transplant some things and move some things out from underneath my seed starting setup because it's full. So it's at capacity. I don't have room to upgrade anything until I get some stuff out in the yard. So that feels good, but also it's like, all right, it's crunch time. This weekend, I am planting. I'm spending the whole weekend planting things out because they have to go somewhere. But the bigger thing is that I got my bee package this last Friday. So I installed that right at the beginning of the weekend, and I did have Chrissy's help with that. So she was invaluable because she's been keeping bees for years, and I got to watch her install her bee packages last year, which really helped me just get in general comfortable around bees for one, but two, to just watch it kind of as a no pressure situation. And so she walked me through it. I actually recorded that and put that up for people who are curious. And I've been watching them. The queen didn't get released the way that she was supposed to. So she's in a cage and they're supposed to eat essentially this candy that's on one end and free her. If she was just free in there to begin with, they might actually hurt her. So it is of benefit for her to be physically separated for a while until they get used to her. And that's just the details of how they put a bee package together that I'm not going to get into right now. but she was not free, so I did have to break that cage open after a few days when I went to check on them and put her in there. And then I was trying to get the frames squished together, but not squish bees, and especially not squish the queen. And there's kind of a timer when you break a beehive open, and so it was very stressful. I'm trying to help you. I want to get out, but you guys have to cooperate with me. Yeah, totally new experience for me. Actually maintaining a hive instead of just accidentally having bees, which was my previous experience. So the bees were the main feature of this week for sure.
I was pretty surprised when I saw you guys only had the jackets on. I was like, oh my gosh, I would have to be in a full suit. Those bees did seem pretty chill, but I would still be so anxious about it.
And that's what I thought at first, because I met Chrissy right at the time that I accidentally got bees, and those were total coincidences. Those were not related. But she's taught me a lot, just because we have geeky conversations, because I have conversations about gardening and beekeeping and chickens, and that's my life. That's what I enjoy talking to people about. But she's the one who guided me to just get the jacket and the veil, which is just, the top half, and then not really need the bottom half. I mean, there are certainly circumstances where I would, like, if I were to catch a swarm of bees, which is a little bit more, native genetics, they might not be as docile as, the bees that are basically domesticated. So I had like an aggressive hive where I was interested in keeping bees that were more resistant to certain things and therefore a little more, I don't know, I guess violent is the right word. Then I might upgrade to that. But I mean, yeah, none of them stung me. The only time that I've ever been stung by a honeybee is when I accidentally flipped their hive over, and that's just fair. They still got the raw end of that deal.
Yeah. Do you still have the hive set up from the last ones, or what happened with that? I know you said that you were getting new ones, and last time we were there you didn't show us any bees. So I assume you don't have those ones anymore.
Yes. I have the hive. So I had found on Craigslist this used hive, which it's not a great idea to buy used hives, but I like breaking rules. So I did it. But it was a top bar hive, and I found it listed for cheaper than I could build one. And I thought that could be a really cool learning experience hive, because last year I didn't have the money to sink into bee infrastructure that I was able to do this year. I've always wanted to have those lay-ins hives that I have now, but that was just kind of like the best thing that I could do. And I found it, and I was like, why not? And then accidentally there were bees in there. The guy who sold it to me thought that they had swarmed and done their thing and they were gone. And I transported the hive and opened it and found the bees and was like, oh shoot, I don't have bees. I gotta figure this out. But they swarmed last year, I think in like early summer, because I wasn't maintaining them. Like, I had not mentally prepared to actually get the bees.
Yeah.
I was just
You weren't quite ready for
taking
them.
an opportunity to get a hive. So that was probably better for them to just leave that scenario. And now I feel prepared. Now I feel like I have the mental energy and time to dedicate to that and actually doing it well and maintain them so that they don't swarm.
I think Chrissy could probably convince Taylor to just do the jacket, but I'm gonna get a full suit no matter what. I freak out. I feel like I'm just such an anxious person that they're gonna be able to know, and I'm just gonna get stung. So that's
fair. I will say those suits are really hot, especially if you're doing it in the summer. That
worth
to
it.
put that on, also with your other clothes still underneath, is hot. But yeah, if at the end of the day that's what makes you feel less anxious, that's what makes you feel comfortable, like, do you?
Yeah, no, I definitely am going to be. But I still think that it would be fun to have Chrissy come help us too. And you, if you would like. You can come together.
I mean, she knows way more about bees than I do.
Yeah, but you could just come for the ride,
Mm.
Take some soil samples.
Oh, okay. Now I'm on board.
We all get to geek out about our specific things. I just remembered something else that kind of happened, kind of didn't happen, I guess. I was in convincing mode, and I think I might have convinced Taylor to get goats this fall instead of wait till spring. So it kind of depends on money
You guys
things.
think you can get your shelter set up and get ready for them by fall?
So we're gonna do like the mobile shelter to start out with and the netting. And I think that like including getting goats, it should be less than like $2,000 to get everything set up for that. If that's the case, I think maybe we'll get a couple weathers because we really need help with clearing and like maintaining the poison ivy. I have poison ivy all over my arm really bad right now. And I'm
I
not
have it on my hands.
like, I don't usually react to it, and I have been recently, and Taylor reacts to it really badly. Like, Taylor's dad does, his friends do, like, everybody that comes here reacts to it very badly, and we have it literally everywhere, including in the garden still. So, it needs to be dealt with, and I know the goats, like, if we consistently have the goats clearing things, that will help us a lot. Not just the poison ivy, we have areas we want to clean that we're not going to get to for years if we don't have the goats helping us. And I think just being able to get used to them over winter and like fall time here instead of just jumping right into like babies in the spring, I think that would be good. So it's on the radar. We're not 100% sure, but I've made my case and it made sense. So I think he's on board.
And on to today's actual topic, which is, again, advice for beginner gardeners. This is going to be a little funny because I don't think both myself and Mickayla have followed really any of these. I think one or the other of us has broken these. So take it with a grain of salt. If it sounds good to you, try it out. If it doesn't, we give you full permission to ignore that advice because we have done a podcast episode with the worst advice that we've ever gotten and the best. And different things work for different people. So this is from our perspective, this is from our experience, and take from it what you want and leave the rest.
Cherry picking is allowed here. I'm gonna have a hard time saying this one with a straight face because I have most definitely broken this rule or advice. I would say not a rule. Nothing is a rule. I have broken this in every single garden I have ever had, including the pots, probably. And that is keep it simple.
I think surprisingly, I actually did keep my first garden simple. I am not usually a person to do anything in moderation, but with the first garden, it was the classic things. It was the green beans, the squash, the tomatoes, nothing really fancy or off the wall. And once I got my feet wet with that, I was like, "Oh yeah. Next year, next year I'm going to go bigger and I'm going to go more diverse." And then, I went from there, but it was really helpful to me to get my feet wet with those classics, with those, for lack of a better term, simpler veggies that are commonly available, that most people have. Most people know ways to help you, get better harvests or manage bugs on these things that we all tend to grow versus some really off the wall stuff or flowers or things like that. They get a little more intricate and involved.
I think the only thing I've ever done in moderation well is doubting my ability to manage all of the plants. I'm good at keeping those doubts to a minimum, and I'm like, I can do it all. I'm gonna plan all the things.
Yeah,
So,
the how hard could it be, Gene?
yeah,
I think we both have that.
mm-hmm,
Yeah.
for sure. Especially at least when it comes to gardening things. Other stuff, I'm not so confident. Gardening, I'm like, meh. It's nature. It'll figure itself out. I did initially, with my first gardens, start small. So that's an advice That's a piece of advice that I did actually follow. I started small, not willingly, but I was restricted on my space. So space-wise, I started small. Ambition-wise, no, not at all. But if you are starting from scratch and you have 5 acres or 3 acres or 10 acres or whatever, like we mentioned in our ideal garden for a beginner episode a few episodes back, I think. I don't know which episode that was. Starting with a small space, even if you have all the space in the world, is probably going to be a lot more manageable for you if you are just starting out.
Right. There are so many, we'll call them rules and best practices and tactics and methods out there that will be advertised to gardeners, but also specifically, beginner gardeners, because it's an easy piece of content to make and get a lot of engagement with, to be like, here, do this one thing if, in your garden, whatever. And it can be so overwhelming to absorb that information and feel like you have to, one, know it all, and then two, be able to implement it all. And if, like, even now, myself, having gardened for several years at this point, if I were to try to use all of those different tidbits of information, I would get overwhelmed. I've kind of found my footing in gardening, and I know what tends to work for me and what doesn't. Granted, that's different in different areas, different states, different gardens, whatever. But I've gotten better about filtering out those things sort of subconsciously. So starting smaller, starting simpler is just going to help you so that you don't get totally overwhelmed with all the different information that's out there.
The next thing we've got on our little list here is start with what you are interested in and what you like to eat.
This is a really big one, especially when it comes to things that you're doing. Maybe you're doing it as a hobby and maybe you're doing it because you want to save money. But with something like gardening that takes so much maintenance, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of physical energy, mental energy, emotional energy in order for you to keep up with it, in order for it to be sustainable for anyone. You're gonna have to be motivated because you're interested in it. And maybe you really aren't that interested in growing tomatoes, but cucumbers are your thing. You don't have to grow tomatoes just because other gardeners tend to grow tomatoes. There's nothing wrong with you growing 5 kinds of cucumbers if it's going to keep you in the garden, keep you interested in it, and, make you feel good at the end of the garden season, because really that's the point.
Yeah, I have a caveat to this one, as I do with all of them usually. But I guess let me use like cabbage as an example. I don't like cabbage. I've never liked cabbage my entire life. My mom never cooked it, or my parents. Nobody in my life for me has ever cooked it well, where I'm like, this tastes good, or made it in anything where I'm like, yes, I want more of that. It's usually like, the texture of that's weird, I don't like the flavor, sauerkraut or whatever is disgusting. But I've said this a million times on this podcast so far, but I am really trying to work on my texture issues and really trying to expand my palate, because I grew up with such a limited palate. I'm such a picky eater where I don't like fresh tomatoes. I only like them as sauce or in things. Like, I've gotten to the point in the last few years where I can finally eat tiny diced tomatoes and something without being grossed out. Same with onions, where I like the flavor of these things, but the texture of them messes with me. So cabbage, I haven't successfully grown a cabbage yet. Actually, maybe I did a little one last year. I want to grow them because I'm invested in a different aspect of it, where I want to have this homegrown food, and because I grew it and I took all this time to grow it and water it and make sure it was not getting eaten by bugs and harvest it and prepare it, I'm invested in it at that point. So I'm hoping that with that process, I'll be more interested in eating it because of that, instead of just going to the store and picking it off a shelf, somebody else grew it, all that stuff. I'm hoping that that kind of helps evolve my appreciation for the food, because I want to appreciate it. I want to like things like that. And I know there's a lot of recipes like kimchi and certain like fresh sauerkrauts that I'm like, I want to try that. It looks so good. I want to like it. So I'm trying to train myself to like these things. So that's a little bit of a different perspective. But for the most part, I do grow things that I like because I'm excited to eat them at that point. I'm excited to eat them, so I'm going to take the time to care for I'm gonna take the time to start a pepper plant in January and care for it for 12 weeks until I can plant it outside, and then wait all summer and water it all summer until it's giving me these peppers, and then I get to eat those peppers all year long, and I'm excited about that. And if I didn't like peppers so much, I probably wouldn't be willing to put all that work in. It's literally a year-long process.
It's also important to get to know your gardening season, get to know your growing season. It is going to be different. It's different between myself and Mickayla, and we don't even live that far apart. So it's going to depend on where you live. It is pretty easily Googleable. Just choose the city that you live closest to. For example, me, I'm kind of a little bit out in the boonies. I have to look at the next closest city. I can't just look at the town that I live in. But Google that. Google your last frost date, which is the last date that it gets cold enough that most plants don't like that. And then Google your first frost date, which is going to be in the fall. It's going to be basically like your first day of, we'll call it winter for simplification. And then the amount of time between your last frost date and your first frost date is going to be your growing season. It's going to be when it's warm enough that most of the plants that you're growing, and especially these things that we think of like green beans and melons and tomatoes and squash, are going to grow during that time.
You guys have heard us in the last couple episodes talking about, we think that our last frost date has passed, and my average last frost date, if I look it up on the Farmer's Almanac website, it says April 18th. Now, the last 5 years here, I think 5 or 6 years here, there has been a frost in the first week of May. So I expect that frost date to shift at some point, but that's why it's so important to be checking your weather app. Honestly, I check that thing religiously, like on a daily basis, multiple times a day. I'm looking at what the weather is looking like, if it's going to be raining, if it's going to be potentially frosting, if it's in the 30s at all, I'm concerned. So this year, it's been a little bit warmer, and I think our actual average last frost date was a little bit more accurate, where usually I wouldn't plant out till May. I think I'm comfortable planting out at this point, and we're recording this at the end of April, like late April, and I'm not super worried. So it's definitely going to be, it's going to change year to year, just depending on the weather and what's going on with the climate in general. So yeah, that's just something you need to keep an eye on. Sage, when is your average last frost date? Because I know we kind of observe similar plant out dates. I call it my observed last frost date.
Right. So technically, mine is mid-May. It's May 15th. This is going to be my third year here. I think last year, the last frost was actually about this time last year. And then the year before that, it was like very, very beginning of May, like maybe May 1st. And so, whereas yours has actually landed later than your average last frost date predicts, mine has landed earlier consistently. And I get weary of that because it's easy to walk outside in April and say, "Oh, today's in the 70s, it feels great. It's time to plant the garden out." But that doesn't mean that next week the low isn't going to dip down to 30, and if I were to have all of my heat-loving plants out, they would not love that. They would probably not survive that unless I, did something to mitigate it, like put Agribon on them or cover them with a sheet or something like that.
Yeah, it's definitely different depending on where you are. We've had days in the 80s, like high 80s at this point, multiple times. I've gotten sunburnt at this point. Just it's been hot for a while here now, but the nights are still dipping into the 30s and 40s recently, and now it looks like they're finally starting to warm up. I think our last 30 38-degree night was a couple nights ago. So, fingers crossed. We're out of that at this point. But if you want to look up your last frost date, it's www.almanac.com, and they have a tab on there that's weather, and it's got a drop down menu, and you can go to frost dates, and then you basically just type in your zip code or your city state, and it's going to give you the one that's closest to whatever your zip code is. And that's going to give you your average last frost date in the spring, and then it's also going to give you your average first frost date in the fall, so then you'll know your growing season length.
Something else that is important is not only knowing your growing season, but also knowing your plants. Not every single plant likes the exact same conditions. For example, tomatoes really, really love warmth. They can't get too hot. So I won't say that they love heat because there's a caveat there. But that same warmth that tomatoes love, lettuce in June, fan. So just taking a little bit of time to do some reading on whatever plants that you're looking to start with and getting to know what amount of sun versus shade that they like, because different plants like different proportions. What kind of temperature they like. Do they like the cooler weather? Do they like the warmer weather? How much space do they need? Typically, if a plant is going to grow really big, like a tomato or like a squash plant, it's going to need a lot of space, whereas something like a green bean plant is not going to need the same thing.
When you're deciding when you want to plant things out and where you should plant them, a couple other things you could keep in mind in regards to the plants themselves, but also the plants that are going to be around each other. You need to keep in mind the shade, if they're going to be tall and shade each other out. And with lettuce, maybe you plant lettuce around your tomatoes to try and give it some shade, just as an example. It might not work. It might work, but you could always try it and see if it works for you. And then also soil temperature. So the tomatoes like the warmth, and they're going to germinate well in warmer soil. That's not something that I put a ton of thought into, other than for my tomatoes and peppers. I put them on heat mats. Everything else, it usually does fine. But that is something to consider if you are more interested in the little details of things like that. Okay, so the next thing we've got for you is exactly why you're listening to this episode. You need to learn the rules, or the advice, as I like to call it, because nothing's a rule, it's all suggestions. Learn the rules before you break them. So, like I said, you're here listening to this, we're telling you all of the rules, quote unquote, and we're encouraging you to do what works best for you. We're encouraging you to break the rules, because now you're going to know them. That's what we meant by that, right, Sage?
Sure, yeah. It's not at all that we break all of the rules all the time.
But we know that we're breaking them. So we've both done a lot of research. We've watched a lot of YouTube videos. I listen to a lot of podcasts and audiobooks on gardening things. So we have all of this information that we've collected in our brains over years at this point. And so we kind of know roughly what people try to do, what to do and not to do, and we can kind of gauge our level of comfortability with breaking those rules. And I think that's kind of an ongoing process. Like, I'm going to continue pushing those boundaries my entire life with gardening. That's just how I am.
Yeah, always. And I think, honestly, one of the best ways that I've learned is by trying things and killing plants. I want to be super clear that no matter how experienced of a gardener you are, there's always going to be that plant that you can't start from seed. There's always going to be that plant that you have a really hard time getting to harvest, if you get it to harvest at all. There's always going to be that plant that you forget to water and that you accidentally kill. Like, experienced gardeners, good gardeners, aren't good gardeners because they never mess up, because they don't make mistakes, because they don't kill plants. They've gotten there because they've killed the most plants.
Okay, so I guess just to give some examples, what is a plant that you can never start from seed, like never works for you?
We have the same one. It's
Yeah.
chives. I just bought chives this weekend because I was like, I'm not even gonna try. I'm done trying. I'm good with just getting this at the nursery.
So I mentioned this weekend I'm gonna dump a bunch of seeds outside into their designated spots and direct sow them because they need to go outside. Chives, I have like 3 packets of chive seeds, and I'm just gonna dump them all outside and see if they grow. Maybe the problem is they don't like me starting them. Maybe they just want to start themselves. They're just go-getters. They don't want the help. I'm hoping that's the case. But yeah, chives is on that list for me. A plant that I forgot to water and killed was literally all of my tomatoes last year. I had to buy my tomato starts because I just completely forgot to water all of them. Like, they were crispy. I don't even know how I forgot for that long. And then one that I tend to forget to sow until it's a little bit too late is my cucumber seeds, and then they always get either bitter or the bugs get to them and they don't do well in the heat once, they're not established enough before the heat hits. And I just every single year forget to plant them on time. So I planted some cucumbers this weekend. So I think I'm a little bit early now. What about for you?
Okay, so we said the one that I can't start from seed is chives. The first year that I was here and that I was starting all of my food from seed, I didn't realize how often that I needed to be watering all the 10-20 trays of seedlings, because once they're to a certain size, and they're like doing their thing and they're growing, and it's also warm and so things are evaporating faster, I didn't realize that I had to water them like every single day. I was thinking, a houseplant schedule where it's once a week, maybe twice a week if I'm like being really conservative. No, it's every day. And sometimes, especially if I have a 10-20 tray that's on a heat mat, which I do for my peppers, basically. That's the only thing I do it for. And they're in the really, really tiny soil blocks, the 3/4 inch soil blocks. Those, because they're so small and because there's that extra warmth, they dry out so fast that sometimes I have to water it multiple times a day. So I killed a lot of my seedlings, like a lot of my seedlings the first year that I was here. And from that experience, I'm now very on top of it. And I check them every morning and every evening because that's my food for the year. But the one that I always have trouble with harvesting is brassicas, especially broccoli. Oh my gosh, between, racing the heat, but also not planting them so early that they freeze, and the chickens always breaking into my garden like right at the wrong time, and all of the cabbage moths, cabbage worms, those pests that just eat them. I really, really struggle with brassicas.
I had a friend post earlier today on her story that she harvested some of her sprouted broccoli, or her bolted broccoli. It had flowers on it, and she said she likes it better once it's already got flowers on it and it's like not a tight head. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. I might have to try that because I definitely harvest my broccoli once it gets to that point usually, because it just goes from like nothing to flowers immediately, I feel like. Something I also have an issue with is the tiny seed cells, whether they're the plug trays or really small soil blocks. I don't ever make time to pot those up. And so I've lost a lot of seedlings to just like they don't have what they need to keep growing and they just kind of peter out at that point. But that's because I start too many seeds.
Honestly, seed starting can be a little complicated, and there is nothing wrong with not growing from seed, with just going to the nursery, going to the hardware store, wherever you can get seedlings, and just buying the ones that are already started. It is a little bit more expensive, and if your primary goal is saving money, maybe you do want to look at starting from seed direct sowing. But you're not cheating by buying seedlings. Mickayla and I still buy seedlings for lots of things, either because they're pretty, and I see them at the nursery when I have no business buying more plants,
Being at the
or
nursery.
because I just struggle with them. Yeah, there's absolutely nothing wrong with just buying the started seedlings where somebody's already done that work for you.
This year, I didn't buy a ton so far. We'll see how my peppers do. I think I might have stunted them. But I didn't buy a ton of seedlings. I bought investment seedlings, if that makes sense. They're more like perennials and herbs, where I'm gonna try and keep them alive over the winter if they don't already stay perennialized in the winter here. So like thyme, I'm gonna put what are they called? Cloches, I think. Like glass things or buckets or something over them in the winter to keep them warm. So I invested in some chives because I just can't start them. Thyme, a few thyme plants, some peppermint plants, another rosemary, just a bunch of herbs. Those kinds of seedlings are just, they're easy to find at the store. No matter which nursery or store you're going to, they're going to have those things. And I like to invest in those instead of trying to start that kind of stuff myself. I do have some lavender and whatnot that I started this year, but if you're just starting out, there's no shame in just getting seedlings from the store. Honestly, there's no shame in it no matter when you do it, because sometimes you're just at a really busy point in your life and it's like you can't. Or you mess everything up like I did last year and you have to buy tomato starts. It's okay. There's always next year. And you're going to keep learning.
One thing I will say is if you do choose to grow from seed and you're not buying starts that are ready for, to put out in your garden, be aware that you do need to harden your seedlings off. You cannot, and I break this rule, but you cannot take your seedlings straight from your seed starting rack and just plant them outside, um, and expect them to be unscathed. They can get sunburned because they're not used to the direct sun. That's what I struggle with most. And then there's just general transplant shock that it's healthier for them. It's easier for them if you take a little bit of time to shuttle them. Maybe the first day you do an hour of direct sunlight and then pull it back in. And then, you gradually increase the amount of time that they're outside in those harsher elements versus indoors in their cozy seed starting setup, before you actually fully transplant them out in your garden.
I'm thinking about this, and I think if we had a shared homestead, we'd be unstoppable, because you like starting seeds and you're good at remembering to water things.
I do.
I'm really good about being diligent with bringing them in and out to harden them off for like over a week, and you're not.
I'm not.
And I like weeding, so it's like perfect.
Ugh, I hate weeding.
Well, we'll see how much I say that once it gets to be 100 degrees. Right now, I'm cool with it.
There you go.
Weeding are friends right now. The next thing we've got in here is, when in doubt, add compost. I did this tonight because I was running out of seed starting mix, and I was like, I got trays to start. I'm gonna just put a bunch of compost in it and like mix it all together and watch. Those are gonna be the happiest seedlings I've had all year. I guarantee it.
Compost, at least in my garden, is pretty much a catch-all fix-it solution. If something is drying out too fast, add some compost. It'll hold water better. If something is struggling with pests or disease, or, the leaves are turning yellow and I just don't know why, throw some compost at it. Not, it's not going to make anything worse.
I don't want to get like super into it, but it's also, it adds, or adding any organic matter to your soil, especially compost, is just going to make it happier, because something that doesn't get talked about a ton is just like the fungal and bacterial life in the soil and like the worms and everything. That contributes so much to your garden and how it's going to perform. And adding compost, adding organic material to your garden is just going to supercharge your garden. It does not hurt. It literally cannot hurt it. Unless it's maybe like really fresh chicken poo or something. That's not finished compost. We're talking about finished compost.
Technically, there is such a thing as too much compost, but that's like you can also have too much oxygen and too much water. Like it's pretty hard to push it to
We
that
don't
point. But just so you
we don't
know,
have rules here.
as a technicality, it's possible.
In addition to compost, something I have really started to absolutely adore for my garden is mulch. I was kind of against it at first because of past experiences. But this year we went all out with the mulch and it's already paying off. So it's going to save you a lot of time after you get the mulch onto your garden. You aren't going to have to water as often. You aren't going to have to weed as much, at least after a little while. Once you've weeded the initial weeds that pop through the mulch, you probably won't have to weed much after that. It's going to hold water in. It's just going to make your plants a lot happier. It's going to keep the temperature of the soil a little bit more regulated in the hot summer days. And when it gets cool at night, it'll keep the soil warm. And honestly, your plants are just going to like it. Nature likes to have its surface covered up. The saying is like, nature's modest, Mother Nature is modest, or whatever. I don't really like that saying, but
Ugh, I
I
hate
do
that
too.
saying.
But it's
Anyway,
honestly like, it's true where like, if you don't have anything on your bare soil, weeds are going to try and grow there because seeds are going to be blowing in the wind or birds are going to be dropping them in the dirt and nothing's protecting that soil. The soil can wash away or blow away in the wind. And you want to protect all that compost that you're putting in there, all of the hard work that you've put into your soil. You want to protect that with a layer of mulch.
I have not always been someone who puts mulch on their garden. It's something that I started being really serious about when I moved here and have an insanely large garden space to maintain. I cannot easily spend an evening and just weed everything. It would be like spending a week to weed everything. And I have seen such an insane, like truly insane difference where I have put wood chips and where I have not. Even just in the last year. You know, last year I was great about putting wood chips on the closer end of my garden because it was just closer to the wood chip pile, and eventually I ran out of wood chips and just said, whatever. And that end of my garden has, like, the soil's a completely different color in a great way. It's dark, it looks nutrient rich. The chickens ended up being much more attracted to that area because it has more life in it. It has more worms, it has more bugs, it has all of those things that are wonderful for the soil microbiome. And I have almost no weeds over in that area. Now, if I didn't do anything, give it a month, they'll be there. But it's a world of difference. It's in the same garden area and they look like two different gardens. It's kind of crazy.
I spent probably 4 or 5 hours this weekend weeding, and I got like 3 or 4 beds done out of the 20 something we have. And I don't have to weed the ones that are already mulched, so I'm weeding them to mulch them. And I'm so excited. Last year, our garden was just mostly weeds. We still got so much food out of it, but it was a stressful amount of weeds. Like, we would have gotten so much more had I maintained weeding or we mulched it. And I'm very excited to see that in a year or two from now and see how the mulch has kind of changed the soil. Because even just having the soil covered up on most of our beds, that soil is significantly better quality this year and a different color than any of the soil that was left open or just left, uncovered. In whether that's tarps or mulch, either of them, they both have really nice soil this year. So mulch your stuff. That's a rule we're not going to break. Mulching.
I don't know. I might get lazy. I might be like, I'm done.
Nope. Pardon, that one's like the only solid rule that I have for the people here. Do not forget to mulch.
Mulching is the only rule.
Mulching is our only rule.
Something I have been humbled on is genuinely how much of a workout gardening is for so many reasons. One, you're bent down planting things, especially if you have a large garden, for so much time that it has put strain on muscles that I didn't know that I had, and I have truly genuinely injured myself, and it's now something that I have to, maintain in the long term because I didn't take it seriously enough, because I didn't do things like stretch. I was like, I'm fine, at the time. Not anymore, but at the time, I was 20 something and I was like, I'm fit. It's all good. Like I do I push my body all the time. This is nothing new. But it was in a different way. And yeah, I at least partially slipped a disc in my back from gardening. It's it's no joke, I promise you. And if I had stretched, or if I had done it in more moderation, which, let's be real, that was never going to happen, I would have served my body so much better, and I would have set myself up for much more success.
This isn't something I've ever actually really talked about publicly, but there was a point I think it was early March, maybe late February, that I was going to the chiropractor literally 4 days a week because I had messed up my body so bad. And it wasn't just, I will give the disclaimer, it was mostly because I stare at a computer all day, not because of garden work, but that was contributing. The way that I set up my garden beds for the most part was either tilling, which tilling the clay here is a lot of hard work. It is such a workout, and it's very painful after a while, like holding the tiller a certain way on my back. And then the other ways that I did it were like sheet mulching, or the back to Eden style, where it's the mulch or the cardboard and then soil and compost on top and then mulching. Hauling soil and mulch from the other side of our property in a wagon and like having to dump it out from a tarp because we didn't have a dump cart or anything at that point, that's way more of a workout than you expect. Even just shoveling it into the wagon, it's a lot of work. I'm to the point where I can comfortably, like, I just lay out a blanket when I'm planting or weeding, and that doesn't really hurt my back anymore, or it doesn't feel like a workout to me anymore. But definitely getting bed set up, mulching, and just a lot of other aspects of it, the manual labor of it is a lot on your body. We have started doing yoga because a couple times a week, because Taylor is also getting really sore. We both go to the chiropractor on a monthly basis at this point, but it was literally 4 days a week for me for over 3 months straight last spring because I was in such bad shape.
And to give some additional perspective, that we're not blowing this out of proportion. What my body was used to before I started homesteading, I've lost, I'm weaker now, and I have less muscle definition now that I've homesteaded for a couple years because I've had to forego the gym. I was going to the gym 6 days a week, most weeks. I was weightlifting. Like, we're not exaggerating. I can lift a lot of weight. I can move a lot of weight. I genuinely push my body really, really hard. And shoveling the compost, shoveling the mulch, moving it up the hill in the wheelbarrow, pushing it through the garden, shoveling it onto the garden, being crouched over, transplanting all this stuff. It pushed me past the point that my body could take. So go slow. if you're not used to pushing your body that hard, go slow, ease into it. It's normal to be sore, and don't be like me. Actually listen to your body.
Especially if you live on the side of a mountain. Like you.
Also key. Yeah, that does not
No.
help.
I'm going like horizontal with the slope. You're going up a slope. So.
Straight.
Yep.
Straight up. Yeah.
It is not a small amount. So this is kind of one we touched on a little bit earlier, but I just want to straight up say it. You need to make sure that you are expecting to fail and make room for that to happen, and make sure that you're not letting it deter you from continuing to pursue your garden. Because it's going to happen. It happens to all of us. We told you a bunch of stuff in this episode that we still are not good at, and things that we failed at in the past. And I personally try and look at failures. I hate calling them failures. Like, I don't like the word failure. I just look at it as a learning experience where, I forgot to water my tomatoes last year. I learned that they obviously need to be watered more than I was watering them this year. I learned that I needed to put them in a different location than I had them last year so that I could remember to water them. So it's not just that. There are so many circumstances.
Right. I mean, even now, even as an experienced gardener, not even as a beginner gardener, if I didn't make room for failures, if I expected to get, no pest damage, if I expected to not have to, lose some produce to dead plants because I forgot to water them, or bugs, or chickens, or whatever, if I didn't leave room for any of that, I would dislike gardening. I would not enjoy it because it would feel like I messed up. It would feel like it would be so discouraging because I set my bar way too high, like unachievably high. No matter how much I know, no matter how much time I sink into the garden, I'm always going to deal with pest damage. I'm always going to deal with loss. I'm always going to deal with dead plants. That is part of it. If I wanted, or if I expected it to be perfect, I wouldn't continue to garden.
I think that really applies to not only beginner gardeners, but also if you're starting a garden for the first time on a new piece of property or in a new location. Like last year, I tilled most of our beds, and the plants that I put in those tilled beds didn't really do as well, and the weeds were a lot worse than in the beds that I didn't till. And so I learned, I didn't fail, they still grew, but I learned that I like mulched beds better. So there are so many examples of that, and that's just going to depend on which rules you decide to break and try and see what works for you, where you're located, how far along in your journey of gardening you're in. And I don't know. I expect to fail every year with something, if not most things. I never expect too much because I know that there's going to be something where I'm like, probably going to forget to water that, probably going to not pot those up in time, and it's okay.
And this last note that we'll leave it on is some of the best advice that I've ever gotten, not only in homesteading, but in life, which is just start with what you have where you are. There will always be a more perfect scenario. There will always be a more ideal time or place, whatever, to start. But if you continue to push it off, waiting for things to be better, you're never going to start. And doing it imperfectly is better than not doing it at all.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of She Said Homestead. We hope you enjoyed our chat. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to hear from you. Send your homesteading stories to us at shesaidhomestead@gmail.com. We can't wait to share them on the air. To stay connected, follow us on Instagram for updates and sneak peeks at what's coming up next.
If you like video podcasts, make sure you subscribe to the She Said Homestead YouTube channel too. We can't thank you enough for being part of the She Said Homestead community. Until next time, happy homesteading.